What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you the 4 games this year that surprised me, or games that were better than I expected them to be, really. Now, as somebody who reviews games, I try to keep an open mind and give a game its due before I make any hard opinions one way or the other, or at the very least, point out the positives or negatives of something, regardless of my own personal feelings. I am nonetheless a human being, despite some reports to the contrary, and I'm prone to my own biases against various things that I like and dislike, which can cause some expectations before I ever actually pick up a game, which I think can have a lot to do with whether or not you find a game better than you expected it to be. So, something to keep in mind as we go through this list. Normally, I do 5 games, but in this particular case, it was really only these 4 and it felt disingenuous to add a 5th one just because, so I chose not to. But with no further ado, let's actually dive into this thing and talk about some of these games. Though it is worth mentioning we are only talking about games that released in 2022, which I specify because I review a lot of older games as well. But to kick off this list, we have Expeditions Rome, one of the very early releases this year, back in January, I believe, the latest in the Expeditions series, which for the most part are TRPGs, where we take on the role of someone in history. In the case of Rome, we play as a stand-in for Julius Caesar, being able to recreate some of the events of his life and potentially take them in new directions as well. And I mention that because what surprised me about this game is that it was just a CRPG as opposed to a TRPG, meaning that where TRPGs tend to focus almost entirely on the combat with less emphasis on the normal role-playing bits, Expeditions Rome has all of that. There's choice and consequence, there's character options, you can take things different ways, there's branching story arcs, there's compelling side quests, there's areas you can actually go explore. So what surprised me about Expeditions Rome is that it is simply so much more game than I thought it was going to be, and all the stuff that was there that I was not expecting was also really well done. And you can also romance Cleopatra, which as we all know is the most important part of a game like this. But nonetheless, that brings us to our second entry, and this is a bit more of a recent title, but more specifically one aspect of this recent title, and this is Marvel's Midnight Suns. Now, I've got a review coming up for this one relatively soon, so you'll get my full thoughts on this one pretty quickly, but I wanted to include it because I am very much so on the record for not liking card mechanics in my RPGs, and as many people are probably aware, this game uses card mechanics for its combat. In lieu of more traditional skill systems that you often see in TRPGs, Midnight Suns, which was developed by the makers of XCOM, opted for this card mechanic, and it kind of put me on edge. I didn't really care for it just going into the game, but what surprised me is that it actually turned out to be pretty fun. Now, Midnight Sun has some other problems that I'll talk about in the review, of course, but here I really just wanted to focus on how much the card mechanic surprised me. Now, overall, I wouldn't say that it changed my mind by any means, because while this is certainly fun, I would take just regular skill systems any day of the week. But I admit I went into this game expecting to dislike this, and they genuinely turned my opinion around. It's still not my preference, but this is pretty good. And I think a large part of that comes down to being able to deal with a relatively small amount of cards and be able to hone in on the abilities you want to use for each character. So while there are elements of randomness introduced with the card mechanics, you still actually have a lot more control over it than you would probably think, especially when you take into account the other aspects of combat like the redraws, as well as enemies dropping particular cards that make drawing cards or getting free uses of cards that much easier. And it wound up being surprisingly fun for me. But beyond that, we'll save the rest of my thoughts on that one for the review in a few days, which of course brings us to our third entry, and this is Warhammer 40k Chaos Gate Daemonhunters. This one surprised me for a few different reasons. So if you've watched some of my more recent content covering Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader, you might not be aware that I only started learning about Warhammer this year, specifically with Chaos Gate Daemonhunters here. I had actually never really dabbled much in Warhammer 40k before this. I was aware it existed, of course, but that was about it, and I believe I even start off that review by being like, I have no idea what any of Warhammer 40k is about. But then, just a handful of months later, Rogue Trader was announced, and I had just recently played Chaos Gate and decided I needed to brush up on my Warhammer 40k. And I've been doing a pretty substantial amount of research since. But that's not actually what surprised me about Daemonhunters here. What surprised me about this game was honestly that it was good. So if you're unaware, Warhammer 40k is known for a lot of very mediocre to bad games. There's a lot of Warhammer 40k games out there, most of which people don't care for. Not to say a lot of them don't have their dedicated fan base, if you will, but this is a franchise or license that's known for a lot of very, very average games, which I was also aware of. So when I actually jumped into Daemonhunters and I was dealing with all these kind of cool Warhammer 40k things I'd never seen before, and the fact that the game itself was actually good, it's a very solid TRPG that just recently got some extra content from the time of this video, which was my main complaint from that review, is that there just wasn't a lot of variety to the combat, and it wound up being an experience that I'm pretty fond of, honestly. It's a game I was not expecting to cover at all, but it is the genre that I normally cover, so a lot of people were asking me about it. I jumped into it. I learned all this stuff about Warhammer 40k that I thought was really cool and had a good time playing a fun game, when what I was expecting to happen was to see something more along the lines of the more mediocre games the franchise is known for. But overall, it was a cool experience and I had a lot of fun with it. But that, of course, brings us to our final entry, and this is obviously the most well-known on the list, and it is none other than Elden Ring. This one surprised me mostly because I had a lot more fun with it than I was really expecting to. I've played quite a few Dark Souls or Souls-like games, and they're not bad by any means, obviously. They have a huge fan base. I don't think anybody was waiting for my opinion on that one, but they're not generally my cup of tea. And it's not for lack of trying. I have like 60 or so hours in the first game on Steam back before it even had achievements, which is pushing like a decade ago now. And again, I can see why people love them so much, but personally they weren't really for me, just like CRPGs aren't for everybody, which is what I normally cover. But I wanted to check out the more open world approach that Elden Ring was taking, and of course cover it for the channel, let's be honest, and ultimately I wound up loving it. I do think there are parts of it that could get ironed out that I think mostly have since it launched, but this is certainly another case of going into something with certain expectations of what that genre is and then having them blown out of the water by the quality of this title, which certainly still has those hallmark Souls-like elements that drive some people up a wall, which of course led to some inevitable drama around its release with the reviews and everything, but I loved it, actually. I pretty much no-lifed this game when it released because I couldn't put it down. I played it probably 10 to 14 hours a day until I got the review out, and then I played it some more before finally putting it down. But not only did I enjoy it so much more than I thought I would, I actually wound up making a lot of other content for it as well, a few builds here and there, that kind of stuff, and whenever they finally release DLC for it that's been rumored for a while, I'll probably dive back into it finally, because what made me set it down for a little while was that they kept changing a lot of the weapons and how they would work. So I would be working on various builds and then they'd patch it and change how a weapon worked, and it's like, well, that idea is out the window now. So stuff like that combined with just having other games to cover as someone who reviews games, I decided that I'd come back to it when they were done tweaking things. But more than anything, Elden Ring surprised me because even going in expecting it to be pretty good, it managed to surpass those expectations and be a truly immense, great game that had me hooked for quite a few weeks. But that is the 4 games that surprised me this year, the games that were better than I expected them to be. And the follow-up to this video will likely be my actual favorite games this year, though I'm waiting just a little bit longer for that one because there's one more game releasing this year that I want to check out before I call it a day on my favorites for this year. But that is all I've got for you guys today. I certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe. Don't forget to tell me about the games that surpassed your expectations down in the comment section below. Regardless of all that, truly, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.